Let's have a look at what happens when migration activists talk about their values, about welcoming, about kindness, about community, about openness. One of the things that has come up a lot is the idea of welcome, and then the stories that people tell are actually activism campaigning built on welcome. For example, Amnesty International USA talked about, instead of building a wall, when people come, we build a longer table. So they use this concept of abundance and openness. They use this theme of food. And this is something that comes up so much in values-based migration campaigning, because it's about shared humanity, it's about connection, and about people coming around the table together as equals. It's about real solidarity rather than pity. The United Nations Human Rights Agency's migration team have been trying to use a hope-based approach for several years now, and certainly they came around to the theme of food. So, for example, the UN were able to work with influencers in Southeast Asia and Australia around the topic of food. So you would have a politician meeting a refugee from Syria, and they would talk about food and the food that they cooked. And again, you have this encounter at a level of equals. In Australia, we had different kind of influencers with different background coming together around the issue of food or other topics. Remember our victim to human shift? The story moves away from one person helping another to an encounter at the level of equals. They used storytelling based around these values, and that opened up all these new avenues for storytelling, for communication that was reaching people on a different level. So much of migration communication reaches us at this downstairs brain level where we're talking about politics, economics, scarcity, crisis, danger, right? All of this triggering our downstairs brain. But when we start communicating at the level of food, of connection, of encounters, of human curiosity and meeting people who are different, and how it changes us, the people who welcome, not just the person moving. We've seen so many different campaigns, not just the UN one, coming back to this theme of food and cooking, using imagery that actually activates those values of welcome, of openness, and also just kindness. And several different organizations have produced cookbooks, for example. So it's about starting to activate these ideas and make the association to the issue of people on the move. For example, there was been campaigning around countering Islamophobia and xenophobia in Europe. A lot of very careful testing came to a set of stories that showed Muslim Germans and Germans who weren't Muslim, let's say, working together. And they decided to focus on the area of work. And they found that a good immigrant narrative worked a little bit better when it was in the domain of sport. So it's about friendship and togetherness. And actually, some of that content did prove triggering to people in the movement. Young Muslim activists tried to grapple with this problem head on and say, okay, if we don't want the good immigrant narrative, what do we want instead? They arrived at this shared humanity narrative and tried to bring it to life. So they created stories on Instagram of people with different backgrounds meeting each other, and they built a concept around unboxing, so like you do with products, but they were unboxing stories about their lives. The first idea of the concept that came from the agency was unboxing stereotypes, so very focused on what we're against. So we tried really hard to actually focus on what we're for, and they came back then with a very powerful message, which is about good things happen when we open up. So there's a very good moral argument, right? It's making the case for being open, and which is, again, a moral way of thinking that we can ask people to use when thinking about this issue. Be open to people who are different. If our societies are open, good things happen. So that's another example then of when we find a narrative that we may be uncomfortable with, that's okay. We can ask ourselves why, but we just have to make sure we're articulating what it should be instead. And I find that if we're bringing our storytelling up into this intrinsic value space, it's less likely to fall into those pitfalls. It still involves a lot of courage and vulnerability, however, because people might say we're naive. People may not be used to hearing those arguments. The only way to change that is through constant repetition. We have to stick to our values and reinforce them. These are connections in our brain that need to be constantly reinforced like muscles. And so we can't leave the work of reinforcing ideas and thinking to chance. Someone has to have the strategy to go out and constantly reinforce them. That's why it's so important that we're really clear, not just on what we're against, but what are we actually for. Remember, hope is a muscle, and we are training it together. See you soon.